This week on Newsnight, President Trump's government shake-up leads to changes at NASA. A look at what the administration will mean for the Moon, Mars and the Artemis program, and how cuts might affect the space agency. Plus, Governor DeSantis floats relocating NASA's headquarters to Florida. Newsnight starts now.
Hello, I'm Steve Mort. Welcome to Newsnight, where we take an in-depth look at the top stories and issues in Central Florida and how they shape our community. Tonight on the program, we're going to be looking at what the Trump administration might mean for NASA and the Space Coast. From major changes expected to the Artemis program and the Space Launch System, to an emphasis on putting humans on Mars as quickly as possible, to the future role of companies such as SpaceX and Blue Origin. The space industry and NASA are set for some seismic shifts in the coming years. This evening, we're going to take a look at both the potential short and long-term shifts in emphasis on space policy from Washington and what the implications might be for our region.
President Trump's nominee for NASA administrator is Jared Isaacman. Isaacman, a billionaire businessman, previously led 2 private crewed missions.
Speed inspiration 4.
Those missions were launched by SpaceX, the dominant government contractor at NASA, owned by Elon Musk, who also helms the Department of Government Efficiency. Even though Trump's pick to lead the space agency is yet to receive a confirmation hearing, the new administration is reportedly already having a significant impact at NASA.
We're honored and blessed to have had this opportunity to continue.
The president's demanded a quick return of Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams, 2 astronauts who've been at the International Space Station since last summer on what was supposed to have been an 8-day mission until problems emerged with their Boeing Starliner capsule. NASA also paused the work of several science committees after President Trump's recent slew of executive orders. The agency has also reportedly been working on complying with anti-DEI directives from the White House. The Trump administration is also expected to bring about big, long-term changes. The president alluded to his priorities in his inauguration speech last month, with Elon Musk watching on.
We will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
President Trump there. Well, let's bring in our panel now to break it all down. And joining us in the studio this week, Brendan Byrne from Central Florida Public Media, also has the podcast Are We There Yet? Good to see you, Brendan.
Good to be here.
Will Robinson-Smith coming back to us from Spaceflight Now. Nice to see you, Will.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
And for the first time, Brooke Edwards from Florida Today writes about space for Florida Today. Good to see you, Brooke.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. Good to see you guys. Let's start off with Jared Isaacman, shall we, Brendan? What do we know about him and his priorities?
Yeah, well, he's taken an unconventional path to space, right? As we saw in that package opening up the segment here. He chartered the first all-civilian flight into orbit through SpaceX. He's also bankrolling the Polaris Dawn missions. Conducted the first private spacewalk by a private astronaut. He's invested in space. He's also a billionaire that has an entrepreneur that he started when he was younger. His payment processing company Shift4. So he's got a lot of money to throw at space. But he's a very big advocate for human spaceflight exploration. He's gotten some endorsements from former astronauts and organizations that advocate for human spaceflight exploration. So we can assume that that's what he is going to do moving forward. He may be an unconventional pick, but he now is the second in a row that has gone to space. That will be the NASA administrator, with Bill Nelson being a spaceflight participant himself.
Former Florida senator. Of course, Isaacman needs to be confirmed by the Senate. Until then, we have an acting administrator, right, Janet Petro. I just wonder what stands out to you about her and what she's been doing so far in the job. I think she said that DOGE will take a look at NASA. There have also been a few hundred buyouts there.
Yeah, so she is the former head of the Kennedy Space Center. This was an unconventional pick as well. Usually the associate administrator takes this position. The Trump administration named her as the acting director. In one of her first things that she did as the acting administrator was sent out a company-wide or agency-wide email about how the agency is going to be following Trump administration directives towards DEI, and I know some of the sources that I spoke with that was very unsettling in some of the language that she used in that. But yeah, for the time being, she will be the acting director until there is a confirmation, which we do not know when that will be yet.
Well, what about those efforts to eliminate diversity programs at NASA? I mean, what do we know about those efforts and whether it will impact NASA's work or hiring? I mean, NASA, of course, had promised to put the first woman, first person of color on the moon with Artemis 3. Does it have a fundamental difference to NASA?
Well, you can still find some of that language on NASA websites as far as landing the first woman, and believe person of color is still in that language somewhere, but you are starting to see some of that diversity, equity, inclusion language stripped out from official NASA publications. If you go to certain pages that were linked to initiatives that were either formally or indirectly connected to DEIA, some of those now lead to 404 error pages. There's an initiative that would have furthered connections between climate work and communities in Central America. Pages like that are now starting to come down, and so there's a lot of, I think, questions about operationally what this will functionally mean for the agency, and I think there's just a lot of uncertainty right now, especially among the NASA workforce and some of the folks that, as Brendan was alluding to, that he and I and you have been talking to that are either expressing some consternation or just this sort of chilling effect of they don't feel comfortable really talking much at all because of fear of the ramifications of that, the repercussions of voicing their opinion and the knock-on effects of what that might mean. Obviously, NASA historically has prided itself in being an agency where you can come forward and express yourself, and that has led to mission safety. And so there's some worry, understandably so, that if you create a culture where you can't speak your mind, what does that mean, especially when it comes to human spaceflight?
And critics say we're seeing this across government. Another immediate effect on the agency from the president's executive orders, right, Brendan, is that sort of pause in work on science programs. What do we know there?
Yeah, so these are agency work groups, and the pause was, again, to make sure that these work groups are in compliance with new policies that the Trump administration has put out, like DEI. These are really important work groups that sometimes contain hundreds of scientists that provide advisory information to NASA as they're planning interplanetary missions and other science investigations as well. So a pause in that really sets back all of these missions that a lot of times are on time crunches to get launched from this planet during certain windows to make it to their destinations in time. So,
well, talking about interplanetary missions, eventually at least, I want to talk a little bit about Artemis and the Space Launch System later, Brooke, but we got word this week from Boeing about likely layoffs of its employees that work on Artemis. What do we know so far from your reporting? I mean, is this simply a matter of the SLS nearly being finished, or is there concern about the future? What do we know?
There is definitely some concern, but this week I reached out to Boeing, and what they got back to me was that they're going to be releasing 400 employees within the coming months. They said it by April. So what we know by the Florida WARN Act, they have to give their employees 60 days notice. So we're going to be seeing these layoffs pretty soon. What we don't know yet is what missions are going to be impacted or what positions are let go. That remains to be seen. What they're working on basically is they're working on the core stage of the rocket. Artemis 2's core stage is already standing upside in the VB. The problem with Boeing is, which I reported on last summer for Florida Today, was that a NASA report said that Boeing is over budget and way behind, years behind, with an upper stage of the rocket, which is going to power Artemis 4 and beyond. So basically, it's just a waiting game to see.
Interesting, and I'm sure you'll be keeping an eye on it. Will, I just wanted to talk about the speedy return of the astronauts from the International Space Station. President Trump had asked that those astronauts be returned expeditiously. Of course, they were taken into orbit on Boeing Starliner last year. What has changed about the timetable, and do we know whether that was a result of the president's demands?
So the biggest thing that's changed in the timetable is the spacecraft that's going to be launching next from Florida Space Coast. So NASA typically has these 6-month increments with its astronauts that go to and from the International Space Station. Right now, Crew 9 is on the ISS, Crew 10 is going to come behind them originally Crew 10 was going to be using the 5th and newest Dragon spacecraft from SpaceX. To make a long story much shorter, the rollout of that new Dragon has been running into some issues, and it was originally going to be launching in late February. That became late March. It's sounding like work is still needed to continue, so it's to be determined exactly when it'll be ready to fly. And so in order to not further delay the launch of Crew 10 and consequently return of Crew 9, including Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams, they decided to swap the Dragons, and so that created the new launch date of no earlier than March 12th. Now, where that all fits with the president's comments and what we heard from Elon Musk on X, it does create some questions of, did one directly lead to the change of the other? Hard to say, but NASA has a lot on its plate, especially when it comes to the International Space Station and its timetable. I mean, they want to see the launch of Sierra Space's Dream Chaser space plane up to the space station, have the regular rotation of Crew Dragon spacecraft and cargo Dragons as well. So to get this crew complement, handed over, is helpful for them to move things along. So it all sort of works in concert.
Well, either way, I'm sure Butch and Sunny will be glad to get back onto terra firma soon enough. But be sure to join the conversation as well on social media. We're at WCF TV on Facebook and Instagram. You'll also find us at Newsnight WCF on X. Next night, let's expand out the horizon a little bit and look at some of the longer-term changes that could be coming for NASA. I sat down this week with longtime CBS News Radio space reporter Peter King, and we started by talking about the future of the Space Launch System and the kinds of upheaval NASA faces when a new administration takes over in Washington.
The Office of the Inspector General at NASA said that basically they've spent $25 billion on SLS so far, and that every subsequent launch after the next one, the first 4 launches really, would cost $2 billion apiece. That's a lot of money for a rocket that's disposable. You use it once and throw it away. For perspective, shuttle launches each cost about $365 million. The SLS Space Launch System has also been called the Senate Launch System because it was the Senate that pushed it through, and Bill Nelson, who was our former senator from here and the most recent NASA administrator, was behind that. And there is a lot of speculation that at some point SLS is going to have to go away because it's simply too expensive and too far behind schedule. The question becomes, does it mean that they fly this and what's already in the VAB being put together and it's one and done? And the question is, if they stop SLS after that, what do they use?
I mean, Elon Musk has said he wants to get to Mars. The president has said he wants to get to Mars in relatively short order. I wonder how much of this eventually is going to fall to the private sector. NASA's obviously invested a huge amount of money in the Artemis program, but at the end of the day, do you anticipate it coming down to the private sector to try to get us to these places?
I think you may absolutely be right on the money with that, because there's only so much money that the government has and that the taxpayers are willing to put into something like this. I think, if anybody's going to get there first, I think it's going to be Elon. But the question is, how soon will that happen? Yeah. I think he wants to be there by, 2028, 2029. I think that's a fantasy dream, but I also wouldn't put anything past him because he's really accomplished a lot with SpaceX. The other thing is that Elon, of course, has Trump's ear. Yeah. And we're not just talking about DOGE, which is going into all the government agencies. Hasn't gotten to NASA yet, by the way, as far as we know. But he's got Trump's ear, and Trump believes in him.
But does the line between NASA and private industry get blurred? Jared Isaacman, of course, is the nominee to be NASA administrator. He also has a space company. You've got Elon Musk, who's a special government employee, who's also got a space company, and he's a government contractor, a very, very large one. And I wonder whether, for all intents and purposes, NASA is not the same agency that it was decades ago.
No, it certainly isn't. But, space isn't the same as it was decades ago. And you've got a problem with Isaacman and with Musk. Conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. Where is the wall between, the good of the country, the good of space, and the good of business. And somehow they have to figure out how to make all of that work. We know that both of those guys have Trump's ear. And I have no doubt that Isaacman will be a good administrator for NASA because he believes in space, and he's proven it by the kinds of investments he's made.
You've covered the space program for a long time, right? You've seen presidential transitions happen. You've seen presidential administrations have changes in priority. And I wonder whether it's common to see this kind of upheaval when those events take place, or is this a sort of a different level from what you've seen before?
Well, there are always going to be changes. It was a pretty steady hand from the beginning of the space age, from the Eisenhower era, really through Bush II. After the Columbia accident, though, the second President Bush said, okay, we've got to end the shuttle program safely, finish the space station, and then go on to Moon Mars with something called Constellation, where they developed new rocket designs. The Orion spacecraft was originally part of that.
Yeah.
But guess what? President Obama elected in 2008, and shortly after that, there's a report from Norm Augustine, the former head of Lockheed Martin, that basically said Constellation is not sustainable, and they wound up launching the Ares 1 rocket once, and that was it. And they started from scratch all over again, keeping Orion, but dumping the rest of the Moon Mars initiative that had been called Constellation. So things can change, and I think we can expect to see changes when it comes to whatever Artemis is going to become.
Peter King from CBS News Radio. You can find my full interview with Peter on our website, wcf.org/newsnight, also on YouTube. It's a fascinating discussion, so hopefully you'll check it out. Brendan, let me start with you on a big picture question. What do you think we'll see emerging in terms of the Trump administration's key goals for NASA? I mean, it hasn't been anything concrete outlined yet.
I think building upon our conversation from earlier in the show, with a pick like Jared Isaacman, you can see that there is going to be a large focus on human space exploration, right? I mean, Isaacman is a champion of human space exploration. He's very close with Musk. Musk has a very big focus on that as well. I can certainly see that being the driving force of what happens in NASA's kind of long-term goals while they're at the helm.
What do you think, Will?
Well, I think that's right. I think there will be a pretty heavy focus on both human exploration as well as Mars exploration, whether that's through robotic missions like we have seen historically, or whether there's a further push for humans to have their footprints on Mars, given the comments that we heard from President Trump during his inaugural address to Elon Musk's determination to get humans on Mars. You see him walking around with Occupy Mars on his t-shirt underneath a blazer continuously. I think there may be some changes where it concerns the Artemis program, though, when you look beyond the Artemis 3 mission, given that there's already a lot of hardware in flow right now for those next two human missions. But starting with Artemis 4, you need the exploration upper stage, which Brooke mentioned. You need a new mobile launcher, which is currently being built at the Kennedy Space Center right now, but it's still to be determined if there may be some cuts to that, to the gateway, to what the future Artemis architecture looks like practically.
Well, what do you think, Brooke, about the Artemis program? Maybe you've been covering that. Long-term changes to Artemis, what do you see? I mean, NASA has said that the SLS itself is essential.
They have, definitely, and their long-term goal was to go to Mars. The moon was going to be the first stop, then they were going to establish the gateway and then off to Mars eventually, but that was far into the future. But what we see with Elon Musk, and especially his Starship, and with now President Trump's push towards Mars, this remains to be seen. What could be, like Will said, what could be changed with Gateway?
What about the contractors for SLS and Artemis, Will? What are they saying? Have they said anything about how they see the future of this?
Well, they were actually asked very directly by one of our colleagues at the Spacecom conference at the end of January, with this new administration, what do you think? What are you telling your workforce? And the representative with Lockheed Martin, basically said, look, we're telling them basically what we tell them every 4 years, which is this is a period of change. Things will adjust and adapt. But as far as we're concerned, as a a NASA prime, we're going to keep our heads down and we're going to continue to do the work that NASA is asking us to, as long as NASA is asking us to, and they'll remain focused on the missions at hand. backed by Matt Ramsey, who's the Artemis II mission manager, who said, our focus right now is Artemis II. We're going to continue to let that be, the big driver for the Artemis program and for NASA.
I'm just wondering, we heard from the president earlier talking about that sort of renewed emphasis on getting to Mars, which of course is the eventual goal of Artemis, but he wants to do it by 2029. Are the president's goals attainable?
Steve, I like to think that I'm more optimistic than some of my reporting colleagues, and I don't think that that's happening.
Yeah.
2029 is a very, very difficult time to get there. But we've seen it in Trump's first presidential administration. He wanted a big milestone event to happen in space. That's why he increased the timetable of the Artemis missions in that first term. He wants something big for the second term as well, so he's going to continue to push that. For a number of reasons, I think Mars 2029 is just not going to happen, right? We still haven't gotten humans on the moon yet, and the hardware's not in place there. So I don't know. I don't think 2029 is going to happen. Yeah. And plus, you have to remember, you only have limited time slots to get to Mars, right? When the planets are aligned and they're closest there, it's like every 2 years. So you're really under a time crunch to get all this hardware prepared to get humans safely there and back, if that is the goal.
Do you think so? And I wonder how much also Elon Musk is driving this agenda, because Elon Musk, of course, as you mentioned, is very keen on getting to Mars himself.
Given that there's so much new technology and approaches that are being rolled out through the Artemis program, a lot of them being tested on the moon to make Mars a more viable option, I think it's going to have to take longer. And a big driver of that is SpaceX and Starship under the current Artemis architecture, given the development of that vehicle to be able to launch rapidly. And, we still have to see SpaceX demonstrate that they can do an on-orbit propellant transfer. That's a very difficult thing, to put a Starship tanker in orbit, put enough propellant onto that, then offload that to the lander version of Starship, and then send that to the moon to dock with Orion, to go down to the surface, to come back up again. So there's a lot that still has to be proven out before we get to the moon, let alone Mars, which introduces a whole nother set of complexities, of challenges, if for nothing else, the human psyche of just being gone that long and that far from Earth, which we've never done before.
There's a reason why they say space is hard. All of this brings to question this issue of a conflict of interest that Peter just referred to in his interview. Elon Musk, of course, is charged with trimming the government and is a large government contractor. What are the concerns at NASA about that?
The main concern right now is the Artemis program, specifically the SLS rocket. SLS is right now, from all the reports, very much over budget, around $93 billion over budget. And Elon Musk's Starship, even though it's not operational yet, will cut costs drastically, because Starship will not only be able to land the super heavy booster, but it will be able to land the ship. So that's going to bring back rapid reusability and also cut costs drastically. And for this reason, experts have been speculating that why not just cut SLS entirely?
Do we know how Elon Musk's role at NASA is sort of viewed with inside the agency?
I think it sort of is part and parcel to the conversation we had earlier. There's a lot of hesitance to truly speak your mind, so it's a little hard to see the true insight of how the workforce is feeling. But, from, conversations I've had and some of my colleagues, it seems like there's some concern about, how close of, and to Brooke's point, how important SpaceX is as a contractor to NASA, and how objective Elon Musk could potentially be when it comes to making, agency-wide impacting cuts to science missions, to, things that may direct him in his companies, very specifically.
Brendan, is that what you hear?
Yeah, and I would echo that and say there's also concerns that with Musk's ability to be doing these audits, he is seeing documents, or could possibly see documents, of his competitors that have put bids in at NASA and all that. So yes, there are very large conflict of interest flags here, and that is a concern to both people inside and outside of the agency.
We'll see how that all pans out. You'll find a link to the Artemis program, meanwhile, on our website, wcf.org/Newsnight. I want to finish tonight by talking about a suggestion Governor DeSantis made about a month ago. Take a listen.
There is an interest in moving the headquarters of NASA right here to Kennedy Space Center, and I'm supportive of that. They have this massive building in Washington, D.C., and like nobody goes to it, so why not just shutter it and move everybody down here?
Governor DeSantis there. Brooke, what have you been hearing out on the Space Coast? Is there some enthusiasm about the headquarters of NASA moving there?
There definitely is. My recently Florida Today reported on the subject, and basically the CEO of Space Florida, Rob Long, said it was a great idea. Pretty much, NASA is located in Florida already. We launch all the major missions from Florida, from Kennedy Space Center, all the major science missions, from processing to launch.
What about you? What are you hearing?
Obviously, there's quite a bit of diversity from NASA across the United States. Whether you talk about, just later this month, we're going to see a very important NASA mission, Sphere-X and Punch, launch from the West Coast in Vandenberg Space Force Base. Yeah. You've also got Wallops, not to speak of all of the NASA centers across the country as well. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation on whether or not it makes sense to move the sort of nerve system of NASA down here to Florida. I think there's potentially an argument to be made for it staying in D.C., just being closer to the decision makers and the people that craft the budget, having more of those direct conversations. I think it'll be interesting to watch over the next few years. It's hard to say where exactly the winds may blow, but also there's been a push for more people to come back to being in the office. So to the governor's comments of it being a somewhat empty building, I think we'll see a change in that in the very near future.
Well, I'm sure you guys will be keeping a close eye on all of it going forward, but that is all the time we have for this week. My thanks to Brendan Burns, Central Florida Public Media, Will Robinson-Smith from Spaceflight Now, and Brooke Edwards from Florida Today. Good to see you guys. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Really great conversation. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 here on WCF. In the meantime, from all of us here at Newsnight, take care and have a great week.